Thank you, Denisa. That was a wonderful talk. So, okay, our next speaker is going to be Okey Ndibe. Okey Ndibe was born in Yola, Nigeria in 1960. After a career as a magazine editor in Nigeria, he moved to the U.S. to be founding editor of African Community, an award-winning magazine published by the Nigerian novelist Chinua Achebe. He's the author of the novel Arrows of Rain and co-edited a book titled Writers, Writing on Conflicts and Wars in Africa. Ndibe teaches fiction and African literature at Trinity College here in Hartford and writes a weekly column for the Sun of Nigeria. Socialist Action is proud to welcome Okey Ndibe.
I'd like to know whose idea it was to have me go after Denisa. As Denisa spoke, I had a great temptation to escape through the door because she spoke so eloquently and with such power and breadth of knowledge that I actually felt that my job was done. Well, first of all, I'd like to express my deep gratitude to Socialist Action for this invitation to come and tell the story of the struggles of the Nigerian people, Nigerian workers, peasants, the poor of the country, the deprived, to reclaim their lives. But before I get there, let me again spend a minute and talk about Denisa, who in my 5-year career at Trinity College is the best student that I've ever had in class. And I've learned as much from Denisa, both in and outside of the classroom, as I've taught her. I hope I've taught you half as much as I've learned from you. So Denisa is a special person, and she's going to go places. So I'm proud to have been your teacher and to be your friend, and I look forward to seeing the greatness that you're going to achieve with time. Yeah, so basically what I'm going to do is essentially to tell a series of stories about the Nigerian situation. The first thing to understand is sort of to start historically, that Nigeria is very much, as Denisa said, the creation of an imperialist impulse. The people, about 500 plus different languages and ethnic cultures gathered in the behemoth that we call Nigeria today, did not have a voice, did not have any volition to belong to this space that we call Nigeria. It happened that a consortium of British missionaries, British military, and the British trading companies got together in the Great Scramble for Africa and were able to sort of persuade their European cousins to respect that space that we now call Nigeria as the territory of Britain. The first territory section of Nigeria that was annexed by the British was Calabar, the coastal area of Calabar in 1861, followed by Lagos, another coastal area in 1863. And then there was a penetration inland where, again, British forces were able to sign, quote unquote, treaties of protection with the local peoples, or most frequently those who were called their rulers, their traditional rulers. So basically the British will come and say, you know, we're here to protect you from, you know, whoever it was. And these people were then obligated to thumbprint, mostly to thumbprint, put their thumbprints on documents that they didn't understand. But once they thumb printed these documents, it meant that they had ceded themselves, their lives, their territory, their resources to British control. And so in the Great Conference of 1884 to 1885, called the Berlin Conference, or otherwise known as the Conference for the Great Scramble for Africa, European nations considered Nigeria as a territory of Britain. And it turned out that Britain just acquired, again, a place that has been mapped as containing more than 500 different languages and ethnicities, cultures. And often when I speak and I tell people there are 500 plus languages in Nigeria, the temptation is there for the audience to think that I'm talking about dialects. No, I'm talking about languages. If in terms of dialects, I speak Igbo, that's my Nigerian language, and Igbo has at least 20 dialects, and I understand just about half of them. So I could be in the same room with somebody who speaks the same language as I, but we have to resort to English because they speak a brand of Igbo that is so different that English will be the only language that will mediate our discussion. So that gives you a sense of the complexity, a sense of the breadth, of the broadness of this territory that the British acquired in Nigeria. And from the very beginning, of course, the British did not pretend for a minute that they were creating a nation state in Africa or elsewhere. British companies needed vast territories for natural resources, and they needed huge markets for their manufactured goods. That kind of calculation, that kind of rationale basically drove the colonizing phase of the imperial encounter with Africa. Of course, the first phase entailed the tragedy of the Atlantic slave trade. So, in 1960, following years of agitation and of struggle, whereby Nigerians, even though the sense of national consciousness was rather feeble, even so Nigerians were able to struggle in the name of this new-fangled political community and insisted on the acquisition, or the reacquisition of autonomy, of sovereignty. But to sort of go back for a little bit and talk about even the naming of the country Nigeria. Nigeria's name was suggested by a woman called Florence Shaw, who was a girlfriend of Lord Lugard, Frederick Lugard, the man who became the first Governor General of Nigeria. And she was a columnist for the Times of London, Florence Shaw was. She was dating Lord Lugard at the time. So in 1897, she wrote a column proposing that this new territory that the British had acquired on the west coast of Africa should have the name Nigeria as a kind of homage to the river Niger, the Negro River. And if your boyfriend, ultimately husband, is the Governor General of this British acquisition, your fancies can become quickly reality. So that's how Nigeria came to be named Nigeria. But in 1960, owing to a number of factors that we need not detain ourselves with.
Does anybody have a Burgundy station wagon parked in the driveway over here?
Burgundy station wagon parked in the driveway? Yeah.
This is very good. Anyway, so Nigeria acquired what was called independence. Of course, on paper, Nigerians were now running their lives. In reality, the affairs of the country were still being shaped, still being determined, still being basically determined from outside of Nigeria, usually from London, and increasingly, as time went on, from Washington, D.C. as well. Now, the first Nigerian politicians who took power immediately after independence saw themselves in much the same way that the British saw themselves. They were conquerors. But whilst the British authorities, while British colonial officials exploited the resources of Nigeria for the interests of the colonial government back in London, the Nigerian officials were now exploiting the resources of the Nigerian people for themselves. So those monies that were being stolen from the Nigerian people went into private bank accounts that were located often in one bank or another in Europe, mostly London. By 1966, things had come to a head, both in terms of the massive rigging of elections, as well as the profound levels of corruption that the military intervened for the first time in Nigeria's affairs in 1966. And then the coup, the first coup of 1966, was soon followed by a counter coup again in 1966, 6 months later. And then Nigeria went downhill. Of course, every coup was welcomed by a section of the country as an opportunity for regeneration, for reclamation of the Nigerian space. But obviously, nobody carrying a gun stages a coup d'etat in order to hand power and resources over to the people. What happens is that they feel that they are now entitled to the resources that they've conquered. And that's pretty much, this simplifies it, but that's pretty much been the behavior of successive Nigerian governments, either those that have attained power through rigged elections or those that have attained power through the ballot through bullets. So in the mid-1980s, Nigeria witnessed, by the way, so Nigeria has the largest population of black people in the world, 164 million. Every fourth African, every fifth African is a Nigerian. Every seventh African in the world, I think, is a Nigerian. So this is a colossal population that we're talking about. And yet, and so this country has produced some highly educated people, extremely highly educated. Some of the best writers in the world today, novelists, dramatists, and so on, Nigerian. You think about Chinua Achebe, the author of Things Fall Apart, or Wole Soyinka, the dramatist and poet, who became the first African to win the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1986. So you have a core of highly educated people. Now, in the mid-1980s, a military dictator, Ibrahim Babangida, came into office, and Nigeria has not been the same ever since. Ibrahim Babangida took over and introduced, at the behest of the IMF and the World Bank, a series of liberalization policies called Structural Adjustment Program. This meant that overnight the Nigerian currency was so devalued that it was worthless. This meant that the entire middle class in Nigeria was gutted. This meant that professors in universities in Nigeria had to take jobs as cab drivers in the evening in order to be able to meet their financial obligations and so on. The massive destruction of the middle class was compounded by a series of policies, of brutal policies by the same regime that drove a huge chunk of Nigeria's intellectual class out of the country into exile. The country has not recovered. So Nigeria used to have some of the best medical doctors in Africa and even some in the world, some of the best professors in the humanities, in the sciences and so on. But these were now operating out of Europe and North America and Asia, some parts of Asia. And so And as Ibrahim Babangida was doing all of this,